Yeah. Hello everybody. Hello, we'd like to welcome you very much to our panel. Thank you for coming. And as you presumably know, we're going to be talking about the challenges of working with what's been termed here underrepresented languages. Of course, all languages are equally important, so we can't have these terms, but we've got a wonderful panel here today. I'm just going to be chairing and try to stay out of things, but I'm Antonia Lloyd Jones and I'm the co-chair of the Translators Association, and I'm a translator from Polish. And on my far right we have Nicky Harman. Nicky Harman is the other half of the chair of the Translators Association. We're a sturdy four-legged thing that doesn't collapse when you sit on it as a chair. Nicky translates from Chinese and is extremely experienced, has a very long list of publications to her name. And she has started up a fantastic initiative, which she'll tell you more about, called Read Paper Republic, which is a short story project online producing translations of Chinese stories and getting an awful lot of new writers out there in English. And she's also working with the Writing Chinese project for this year, last year, and the year before at Leeds University. And she's won all sorts of prizes for her work. And then to the left of Nicky, we have Poopoksakul, who is a translator who used to be a lawyer. Wow, that's quite a big change. And Mui translates from Thai into English, and she has been working with Words Without Borders on a special Thai issue that they've done. And she is Asymptote's Thailand editor-at-large. And she has translated a collection of short stories by a Thai author called Prabda Yoon, who we're happy enough to have with us here today. We're lucky enough to have him here today. He's over there. Yes. And so Mui has grown up in Bangkok, and she's also studied in the United States and now lives in Germany. So we've got another multilingual person here. And then we have, on Mui's left, we have Deborah Smith, who is a most remarkable and talented person who translates from Korean, and she's already made a great name for herself by translating novels by a writer called Han Kang. I'm sure many of you here will have read The Vegetarian already and know that it's on every prize list there is. And she's also translated books by Bae Sua, who's another wonderful Korean writer. And she, yesterday, had the launch party for the most fantastic new press called Tilted Axis. And if you see people walking around here with strange tattoos on them, that's because they went to the Tilted Axis launch party. And this is a non-profit press that's going to aim to publish, well, Deborah will tell you a lot more, but from various very underrepresented languages of Southeast Asia and Central Asia. And to my right is Peter Bush, who is the former director of the British Centre for Literary Translation. He's a translator from Spanish, but also Catalan. And he's probably translated more from Catalan than anybody. And has won various prizes also for his work. And I think this is absolutely wonderful distinction. Peter has a medal. He was awarded the Creu de Sant Jordi for his translation and promotion of Catalan literature. He really ought to be wearing his full military orders, but he's not. So I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists about the advantages as well as the disadvantages of translating from what we think of as a minority language, and how do you think about that language? What are the pluses and what are the minuses? So, Mui, would you like to start?
Sure. For me, as a relative newbie, translating from Thai has definite advantages. The biggest ones being, when I first, I just started doing this about 3 years ago because I practiced law for a few years before switching. Is it on? Okay,
yeah,
I'll just put my face closer. Okay, so what I was saying was, for me as a relative newbie, translating from Thai has very huge advantages because when I started doing it, I just kind of dove in head first, and the authors who are already really famous have been massively approachable and really helpful. I mean, I can tell from you a story from my experience. The first book that I translated is by Pravda, who's standing back there. I basically had written an essay about one of his stories, and I knew that he had a bookstore, and I just dropped by, left him my story and my information, and a month later he miraculously actually emailed me back, and that's how this story got started. And from there, everyone in the writing community has been massively supportive. I have been able to get in touch with just about every author that I've wanted to approach, just from other authors giving me their information, or I just randomly Facebook them, or stuff like that. And in terms of text choices, I mean, it's massive. You're basically, because almost nothing has been translated from Thai. I mean, even just starting off, it's like being a kid in a candy store. You can basically choose just about anything. So those are really huge advantages for someone who's new, I think.
And what are the disadvantages for you?
Yeah, so same, because I feel like I really have had to make my way on my own a lot, because it's not something that's been done a lot, translating from Thai. So I think there's relatively little governmental and institutional support in terms of what to do from step one and getting funding. I have talked to people at the Ministry of Culture, and the person that's actually very, very nice and helpful, but I think that they're just not used to the idea of publishing Thai literature in translation with a foreign press. So I think there are so many conditions to the funding that are serious roadblocks for me in terms of getting funding, but I think we're going to try to work that out. But I think that it's sort of like a back and forth of me sort of explaining to them this is how it sort of works in other countries that have really tried to promote their literature, and if we're going to go there, this is sort of like those are some things you should consider. And so that's like on the practical front, sort of one of the big disadvantages, because when you submit your manuscript, people often ask if your country has funding, and that's quite a problem. And some other practical issues that I think that when you translate from a language or a culture that's relatively unfamiliar, it's hard to do a foreignizing translation if that's something that you are after. I mean, I find myself doing a relatively domesticating translation, which I like for the first book that I did because I think it was appropriate for the text. But I think in terms of going forward, if I wanted to work with a different text, I think from a post-colonial standpoint, it's not something that I would be super excited about as much. And the last practical issue I'll mention is that when relatively little has been translated, you're sort of having to reinvent the wheels a little bit in terms of some of the translation issues that come up. Like in Thai, there's a zillion pronouns and honorifics, and you can sort of model some of that based on some of the other languages, but you're not able to sort of check out the very, very specific issues that other translators have done because there really aren't any models.
Thank you. Nicky, what's it like for you as a Chinese translator? I mean, you have there are a lot more translators from Chinese, but...
Yes, there's still fairly few. I mean, of the advantages, I'd say that it's a very exciting field because there's a huge canon of contemporary Chinese literature. Almost everything, so that English language readers actually know very little about it, and the proportion that's been translated is very small. So almost everything that we translators say when we're talking about it is going to be new. Whether or not that's an advantage or a disadvantage is a bit hard to say. I would say, first of all, before I start giving you the disadvantages, that it's a huge privilege. There's an anthology of Chinese poetry called Push Open the Window, And I really do feel every time I read something that I want to translate that immensely privileged to be able to read it, and I feel this burning desire to get it into English and get it out there. So I'm opening that window onto a completely different culture, different way of life, different way of writing. And the writers are incredibly grateful. So this is also extremely nice. Of course, if everything you say about Chinese writing is new to publishers, that is a very big disadvantage, because you really don't want your favorite author to be just a curiosity. You want publishers to feel that they can fit a certain translation into their list and it will interest their readers. So in due course, I'm going to talk about what we, a collective of translators, have done to try and tell publishers and readers what kind of literature is out there, but it is a tremendous challenge.
Yes. Deborah, Deborah, would you like to tell us about your advantages and disadvantages of translating Korean?
Sure, a lot of them are probably quite similar to the ones that Mui was talking about, particularly because despite Korean being, a language spoken by incredibly many people, and a country that is very modern and developed and has a very diverse literary scene. Until relatively recently, there has been almost nothing in English outside of a few university press publications, which are mainly in the US. So working in the UK, again, is sort of a minority within a minority for that. And, the disadvantages are the advantages at the same time, depending on how you look at it. Pretty much no editor is ever going to be able to read the original. So realistically, especially for a first-time author, you are going to have to translate a lot of that book on spec if you're ever going to get anybody interested in it. There also won't be probably an international agent pitching the author. So again, you're going to have to do that yourself. But at the same time, while that means, yes, a lot of unpaid work and effort, and especially when you're breaking in originally, the 12 or 16 months you wait for an editor to even just read the sample and then respond to you. But at the same time, that means that you have the opportunity to kind of act as a curator for this literature. And as a translator, you will probably have other ideas of how you want to shape that than purely commercial ideas that maybe a larger publisher or an agent would. That also means that when you've sort of been that involved in the process at the beginning, the publisher is more likely to encourage you to be more involved with the rest of the process, with publicity as well, because you've built up that relationship with them. They're sort of relying on you to do a lot of the scouting and sort of explaining things to them as well. And then the other thing that can be a huge advantage is that you stand out in a crowded market. I'm thinking of this with my translator and now my publishing hat on as well. When you say that you are publishing, possibly the only Thai translation from contemporary Thai literature to be published in the UK ever, which I think is what we're going to be doing with Mui's translation of Pravda's stories next year. People remember that. When you say you're publishing, yet another similar sounding book from a much better known language, and you're a startup that nobody's heard of, they're not necessarily going to remember that. But then I think the challenge with that is also a bit of what Mui and Nicky have said about not wanting these to be seen as curiosities. So how you then move beyond, okay, we have the one Korean author who is suddenly the one Korean author, or the one Thai author, whether, how easy it will be then to move beyond that and to find a space for more variety from these countries, whether there will be that same push to have more of the same, to have certain genres or certain aesthetics and narratives replicated, obviously with with Tilted Access, the press, that's something that I will be consciously trying to push against. But I think inevitably from the sort of wider publishing industry, there will always be that conservative impulse.
Right, thank you. And Peter, would you tell us about your experience with Catalan?
Well, there are some similarities with what we've already heard, really. Except, of course, Catalan is in Europe, and it's part of Spain. And you might expect that people would know about Catalan and Catalan literature, and that it might be out there, and yet it's not. It hasn't been out there. So that. I should say that Catalan literature, modern Catalan literature, really gets going from the end of the 19th century. And I came to Catalan literature as somebody who, kind of been reading Spanish literature for kind of more than 50 years. And suddenly I was in Barcelona and going to live in Barcelona, and I'd had some contact with Catalan literature, but I never really got into it. And I started reading it, and then I kind of became aware of major European writers writing in Catalan who hadn't been translated. So that, for me was a kind of a great advantage. It's like a treasure trove of major literary figures who have never had really very much visibility. There was an American translator, David Rosenthal, who translated a lot in the 1970s and 80s, but mainly for kind of small presses in the States. And my kind of movement into Catalan literature coincided with developments within Catalonia, political developments where the kind of movement for independence became much stronger, and also there was quite a lot of funding for, this is an advantage, for helping the publication of translations, kind of organised by the Institut Ramon Llull. And I think a key point was in 2007 when Catalonia was the country that was invited to be the country, guest country, showcased at the Frankfurt Book Fair. And I think that kind of gave a big impulse to publishers throughout the world to kind of look at Catalan titles and look at Catalan writers. I give you an example of one book I translated. In fact, in Catalan books that have been translated, there's really no kind of one figure that has become a kind of like the figure that's identified with Catalan literature. But one book I translated was The Grey Notebook by Josep Pla, which was published by the New York Review of Books. And, Pla began to write this in 1918 and 1919. It was in the form of a diary. And it wasn't actually published until 1966 in Spain for various kind of political reasons and personal reasons. And here it kind of came out with the New York Review of Books in 2011 or whatever, and got a great review in the New York Times. And that, to me, from the point of view of promoting Catalan translation, kind of put Josep Pla on the map, who is a major European writer. And there are now, I've since done a book of his short stories, and there's another book of his short stories that's going to come out. And I think that for me, it's what I ask myself always is kind of why has it taken kind of Catalan literature so long to get out there? And I think part of the reason is political. I mean, it is a literature and a culture without a state. And in terms of kind of cultural promotion and stuff, that has an impact. And there was always a kind of tension between Madrid and Barcelona. That's there, and it's kind of not going to go away.
Right, thank you. And so, in a sense, you all have a situation where there's an advantage in that you can kind of cherry pick from what there is on offer, but you also have translators often talk about themselves as ambassadors for the culture that they're translating. I know I certainly feel that with Polish, which needs a great deal of help to get out there. So how do you maximize the opportunities of that situation? Can you please tell us about the projects that you've been involved in which aim to promote that literature in a special and unusual way? Because I know you have all been doing specific things. So, Nicky, would you like to tell us about Paper Republic, please?
Yeah. Paper Republic was a website focusing on Chinese literature in translation, set up by Eric Abrahamson in Beijing about 8 years ago now. As a one-man band, it had its ups and downs. Anyway, last year, a group of 4 of us, all keen translators, including Eric, decided that we could use this as a platform for our ambassadorial work. We really do feel like ambassadors for Chinese fiction in translation. And out of that came a plan and a number of goals. So I'll tell you the goals first, and then I'll tell you the plan. The goals, we like to think big, to introduce general readers to new kinds of Chinese fiction, and to push Chinese fiction in translation, because after all there is some already, towards the mainstream of English language fiction and away from being just a curiosity or a niche interest. Very big goal. To make it popular in English. Even bigger goal. We had a couple of subsidiary aims, which was to encourage new translators and to create good networks with other organizations. For instance, Free Word Center, English Pen, Leeds Writing Chinese Project. We are largely Beijing and UK based. There are other organizations in the States who we'd love to be working with and have to a small extent. So what did we do? We decided that as the Chinese love writing short stories, we like translating short stories because they're short. And we hope that readers like reading them, again, for the same reason. They're less of a commitment than a 400-page novel. So what we would do is we already knew we had a pool of short stories already published in rather obscure magazines and online that no one had ever heard of. So we would republish the best of those, and along with that we would translate new ones ourselves, and we'd do it every Thursday for a year. So 52 stories in all, and we started in June last year. We're completing it in June this year, and it would be a free-to-read complete short story available online. That was the easy bit. What we realized was if we didn't actually tell people the stories were there, no one would read them. So we decided we needed to work with these other organizations who already have extensive online readerships and organize some live events. And we've done all of those things. And so we've done quite a bit of networking. And what about the live events? Yes, the live event at the Free Word Center, a free speed book clubbing event a couple of weeks ago, was a sellout, so we were very pleased with that. We focused on 4 short stories about women. We're running translation competitions in Leeds. We have co-published, I think this is quite important, we've co-published with much bigger online literary journals. So LA Review of Books, Asian Char, Asymptote, and so on. And we have made our stories topical. So, for example, when the Chinese government formally ended the one-child per family policy, one of our group wrote to a particular writer and got from her a piece of non-fiction about what it felt like to be in a family where the mother was under great pressure to have a son, there were 2 daughters, and what happened to the mother. And that got a lot of readers. There've been, another one, a story about disappearances called Missing, also got a lot of readers. It happened to coincide with disappearance of a number of Hong Kong sellers who fell foul of Chinese government authorities, and so on. So we've done a whole load of activities, and we're keeping up the momentum. So I think really I will say, in short, what about these enormous and ambitious goals I spoke about at the beginning? Have we achieved them? A bit hard to tell. It's very hard to evaluate this kind of success in figures. Of course, we can keep an eye on who reads our stories and how many people. But I would say our general feeling is that we've hugely increased the profile of the website, for starters, and that is very important because it means we can build on that. And I think the general feeling is that every time someone who reads another language or who has nothing to do with Chinese or has been to one of our events said how much they enjoyed it, that's a mark of success. And of course, this is a drip effect. We're not going to achieve all our goals overnight. So that's what we're working on, and that's what we'll continue to work on.
Thank you. Do you find that if there's stories that you've published online, it leads to, for instance, whole novels by the same author getting interest?
I'd love to
from
say
publishers?
yes.
Yeah, that's the idea.
That's the idea.
Thanks. Mui, have you been involved, or are you hoping to be involved in any particular project to promote Thai literature?
Yeah, so I mean, the ambassador/canon forming issue is one that I think increasingly about, because when I first worked on my first book, I didn't have to think a lot about what to choose in order to represent Thai literature correctly, because I feel like everything was underrepresented, so in a way I couldn't go wrong to start with. But as I move forward, I'm really thinking about it a lot more, and while we haven't started anything like what Nicky has started, which sounds amazing, I've been working lately with Words Without Borders to try to put together a Thai issue, and so that project has really made me think a lot more about how to sort of give a balanced view of what's out there in contemporary Thai literature. So the question of canon forming has been on my mind a lot, and I do realize, as everyone has their own personal tastes and background, and I know I'm drawn to certain kinds of writing. And for example, I translated Pravda because he's from a similar generation, he's an urban person, similar background, so I was very drawn to his literature. But I really want to go sort of the polar opposite for my next book, because I think that there's a whole experience out there of women and rural writers who, that voice needs to be represented as well. So I think that I think a lot about balance forming, but I think because basically whatever I end up translating, it's going to be sort of like overrepresented in some ways. So I'm very conscious of that. But I think there's a huge opportunity there as well for me, because I've lived abroad for so long, to sort of bring the conversation back home. For example, here people are talking a lot about translating women writers, and in Thailand there's still a huge imbalance. I think most of the well-known authors are still largely male, and there are women writers out there, and I do want to translate them. And I think that the question of canon forming for me can sort of be forward-looking as well, sort of like going with the status quo. So I think that in that way you can affect the conversations back home and to create sort of a feedback loop. And for me, that to be able to sort of be a bridge, that's something quite exciting for me.
Thank you. And Deborah, I'd love to hear more about Tilted Axis, because I'm particularly curious about the selection of languages that you're aiming to cover, and how you've decided that, and whether that's a kind of growing field or just accident or what?
Sure. I mean, it's probably a little bit of both. At the moment, I have signed books from Bengali, which is our first book, which we've had printed, which is here, and also Korean, Japanese, Thai, Indonesian, and Uzbek. I've been talking with translators, sourcing sort of recommendations and samples for books also from Nepali and Farsi. And really, yes, it has depended largely on whether I already knew translators who worked with those languages. I find using translators, talking to translators in terms of getting recommendations is the most useful thing, particularly because they are much more likely, A, to also be thinking about these issues of representation as well, to not purely be, again, thinking in terms of what might be a commercial success, which is also, I find, more difficult to gauge by the, I suppose, traditional methods. The more you are working with languages which haven't necessarily been translated into English much, or even necessarily translated into that language as well. So things like, you know, who is incredibly popular there, who has won a major prize there, that really gives you absolutely no guarantee that there will be even sort of a modest replication of that success, because some countries will have, you know, vastly differing tastes. And so, yes, partly again, what I'm trying to do with the language, but also with the other issues, is to push against certain cultural stereotypes. I mean, one of the things that I actually found translating Korean to be really useful is that when you're working with a language and a culture that is so little known, there aren't necessarily any stereotypes that you have to combat at the beginning. But then to ensure that it doesn't sort of fall into that rut. Again, this is the thing about publishing, is people don't want to take risks. They want to go with something which is very similar to something which has already been successful. And when that comes to mean very similar narratives about a certain region or group or country, then that easily becomes a stereotype or a cultural cliche, which can be quite damaging and misleading, and means then that great writing which doesn't fall into that category is going to be missed out on. So I'm trying to look for different narratives and different aesthetics as well that haven't necessarily been represented from certain regions. So for instance, with the Bengali book, which is the first one we've done, I was really fascinated to see how different Indian writing in regional languages is from Indian writing in English, of which there's relatively quite a lot available. And again, what's been allowed through from Indian writing in English has, you know, tended to be sort of very large novels that, you know, represent the teeming modern city, or sweeping family sagas over generations where, you know, Muslim boy falls in love with Hindu girl and they can't get married and it's terribly sad.
Bollywood.
None of which is in any way less authentic or interesting in itself. It's just when you've had the same thing over and over again, it's nice to have something different. And so with this writer, we found an incredibly sort of tight focus, you know, just on the one protagonist, very contemporary, a very surreal style, and nothing to do with colonialism. You would be surprised to find out actually how many Asian writers write books which are nothing to do with colonialism, given that, you know, particularly Southeast Asia, you know, traditionally what little has got through from or about there, you know, has to have that aspect to it. So to look beyond that as well. And then also to look in terms of things like gender. I found sort of quotas actually to be useful and necessary. So I said at the beginning when I set up the company that at least 50% of our list would be by women, because I was aware that in certain countries, yes, there are still huge imbalances, and that therefore if you just go by what is easy for you to find out and what will be recommended to you, you have to be aware that it's not just aesthetics that is creating those sort of canons. It's politics, it's socioeconomics, it's a lot of things. And so if you don't specifically say, you know, tell me about a great female writer, you may never get told about a great female writer who may well exist. but also to be sensitive to the fact that we're publishing from all over Asia. That's most of the world, and the situation in different countries will be very different. For instance, in South Korea, women are in fact more represented in terms of major prizes, shortlists, bestseller lists. So there isn't that issue there. In other countries like, say, India and Nepal, it's not just the issue of gender. There is also the issue of caste, of Dalit writers, of really just looking beyond the establishment in general. So not saying, okay, I want writers from these certain groups, but instead saying, I want to look beyond this sort of more narrow vision.
Yeah. Thank you. Peter, you mentioned the Institute Ramon Llull, which must be a valuable resource. How exactly do they operate, and have you worked on any specific projects with them to promote Catalan literature?
Well, with the Josep Pla book that I mentioned, I organised 2 reading tours in the States, one on the East Coast and on the West Coast. I did 12 events. I went twice, so it kind of involved like 6 weeks. And I planned that with the New York Review of Books and with the Institute Ramon Llull, and they provided some of the finance for that. And I try to put forward Catalan in any kind of forum that there is around. So, for instance, the mentorship scheme. I kind of proposed that, suggested that Catalan might be a possibility for that, and that was supported by the Institute. And the summer school, the City University Summer School, I suggested to the organisers that Catalan, kind of might fit with what they're doing at the summer school, and the Llull have agreed to support that. So really that kind of financial support in terms of projects that I might kind of put forward myself, but also, the Llull has a budget for promotion, which publishers can go to finance advertisements. For instance, the novel In Diamond Square by Mercè Rodoreda, great kind of classic of the Spanish Civil War. When that was published by Virago, there was a kind of page advert in the Guardian Cultural Review, which was partly paid for by the Institute Ramon Llull. So there are all kinds. Basically, the Institute says to publishers, you come up with imaginative ideas, and we will try and help you kind of realise them. I think that another kind of area that I've discussed with the Institute is that, you think, what do you know about Catalonia? What do you think of when you think of Catalonia? Well, you think of Barça, Messi. There's a kind of the football view. There's Gaudí, the architect. There's Joan Miró, the artist. There's Salvador Dalí. There are other architects and other and music people working in music and theatre. But the writers are unknown. And one of the things that when I'm interviewed or I'm working on kind of public events, is to kind of create this idea that in terms of the 1920s and 1930s, there was what Las Ramblas group. We have the Bloomsbury group. Well, in Barcelona, there was Las Ramblas group, because there was a group of writers who weren't so tightly kind of related as the Bloomsbury group, but of the stature of the Bloomsbury group. Now, if you think about it, what Virginia Woolf had for breakfast, what she wore when she went to the opera. But what do you know about, Joan Salles or Josep Pla or Mercè Rodoreda? Well, very little. And I think that one of the projects that I'm kind of thinking about is really what is needed is some kind of social history almost of these figures to bring out all of those connections. Because, the Civil War, the Second Republic, that whole period is very culturally intense in Barcelona. It was very, very creative. and the literature that was being produced is of the level of the architecture and the music and the art. But it needs translation for it to get through. But it also needs kind of information, a history of who are these people that are producing this great writing.
Yes.
And so I think that that is something that we'd like to do, is to have some a series of essays, perhaps, which would bring out the history of these writers and how they fit in the historical social context of Barcelona in the 1920s and 1930s. At the same time, of course, I mean, we translators of Catalan are translating living authors, and there's Mara Fay-Lahem, who's in New York, and Marianne Newman in New York, and we kind of have done I did an event with Marianne Newman at the McNally Jackson bookshop in New York, and we try to kind of work together. But listening to Nicky, I think I wish we could do something like that website on the Catalan short story, for instance. But anyway, that's that. The law has supported with publishers visits and tours by living writers.
Right.
For instance, there's a writer called Najat Al-Hashmi who comes from the Rif Valley in Morocco, who went to live in Catalonia at the age of 8, and then she's become a major writer in Catalan, and her first novel, The Last Patriarch, won the National Literary Prize, and this was a big kind of breakthrough in terms of Catalan culture, but also in terms of Spanish culture. But unlike the UK or the US, there are very few figures who come from a bilingual, trilingual, kind of ethnic minority background who break through into the kind of national cultural perception, visibility. And Najat, when I read her book Last Patriarch, I thought, this is a book for Serpent's Tail. And I immediately wrote a report, sent it off to Serpent's Tail, and Pete Erton wrote it and got another report written, and he agreed to do it. And then Najat, was at the Hay Festival, and I think she's been to the Hay Festival a couple of times. And I'm married to a writer, Teresa Solana, who writes satirical noir. And 3 of her books have been published by Bitter Lemon, and we've done 2 tours in the UK, and we've done a tour in the US. And I agree with what you were saying, really, that it's necessary to have the full range of the work, so that that Catalan literature doesn't become identified with work about the Civil War, for instance.
Right. Yes.
It has to be the whole range of literary experience, because there does to be a tendency to politicize or see literature that comes from Spain and from Catalonia as necessarily being political in some form or other.
Yes, I actually wanted to pick up on that, what Deborah said about stereotyping, and this is something as a translator from Polish that drives me absolutely nuts, that the perception of Polish literature is doom, gloom, concentration camps, war, suffering, and general misery, which actually there's some quite funny, jolly, sexy books out there in Polish. So I was thinking that if you're all clearly representing those languages in a big way and doing a huge amount of advocacy for them, do you, while breaking down those stereotypes, do you also feel a responsibility? Mui said it nicely in the notes she sent me about the canon, forming the canon for the literature that you represent. Do you feel some responsibility, and is that difficult? Nicky?
I think I feel more of a responsibility for breaking the canon rather than forming the canon. Literary writing in China is very tightly controlled by the Writers Association, which is a government organization. I'm not in any way saying that its members are not good writers. On the contrary, but it is an organisation with which they have to engage all the time. It is that organisation that helps to form a canon that does actually form a canon. On the other hand, in this country, if you ask someone who doesn't read a lot of translated books about anything from Chinese, they'll tell you they've read Wild Swans, or at least they've bought it and read the first few pages. So there is another kind of... It's the problem of cultural cliche, it's the problem of stereotyping. Yeah. That's the stereotype, the Cultural Revolution misery memoir. So I see my role is to break through all of those stereotypes.
Right. Mui, do you?
Yeah, for me, I definitely feel the responsibility to sort of shape, to present the full range. I mean, for my first book, actually one of the appeals of my first book that I translated, written by Pravda, is that he doesn't really conform to the Thai stereotypes, because, I mean, there's basically nothing out there, but the image of Thailand, I think, when I was growing up in the US, people think, rice paddies and elephants, and this book is so not that. And so, I mean, that definitely had its appeal for me. But going forward, I really do want to present because we do still have a really large rural population, and I do want to present that story as well. But I mean, it's something that I think more and more about, how to shape how to present the full range, and also as a translator from a rare language, I feel the responsibility also to sort of contextualize each of the writers, this is where they fit into the whole picture. I mean, this person's from the Northeast, and, how is he moving things forward? And this writer's from Bangkok, and, he's from a generation where the country's modernizing, etc. I feel like as a translator from a very unfamiliar culture, especially when I'm doing journal work and doing submissions, I really do feel like, it's my responsibility to tell them this is how this person fits into context.
Thank you. Deborah, have you anything to add on that? Because you already spoke, you said
really
something
quickly,
about it.
Yeah. So I think as I said, I look at it more in terms of not what I want to be in the canon, but ensuring that nobody is being excluded from the canon for reasons other than literary quality. And also the fact that it's not just a representational issue. The representation and aesthetics are completely intertwined, and that actually, if you look for narratives which go beyond the stereotypes, then you will find work that is more exciting. People who are outside the establishment are the ones who tend to be more experimental.
Yeah.
Maybe if they're not the top writers in the country, then they are more free to write, more in tune with their own personal aesthetics rather than what is expected of them. And the other thing is really to look for work that will enable me to sort of further one of the goals of the press, which is to present literature from these languages as art, not anthropology.
Yeah.
Which takes in marketing, which takes in design, which takes in a whole lot of other things, but also really starts with the kind of narrative that you're choosing. But then again, also the aesthetics. We don't really publish much straight realism, but partly because I find that publishing things like, this darkly erotic, surreal Bengali novella, or these sort of witty postmodern Thai stories which have vampires rather than elephants in, makes it easier to do that. It makes it easier for it not to be, and the native informants report on, this is what Thailand is like, this is what Korea is like.
Tourist books. Peter, do you have anything to add? And we ought to move on to some questions after that.
I think that literature in Catalonia is highly politicized, and there is a kind of canon that has been informed by political divisions within Catalonia, and in translating some writers, I think it's Joan Salles, a book about the Civil War, Uncertain Glory. He was a Catalan Catholic Republican. So it's a novel about the Civil War from the point of view of a Republican who was Catholic. And Salles, in some circles in Catalonia, in some decades after, in the kind of 1950s, was frowned upon because he was Catholic. And Joseph Pla flirted at the end of the Civil War with Franco and so on, and for that reason he was a kind of persona non grata, although he was never a fascist, he was never really a supporter of Franco. And I think actually the translations of Pla and Salis into English and their reception in the US and the UK has had an impact on the reception and the vision of Pla and Salis within Catalonia. And I think that's one unexpected kind of development from translation, that sometimes there is a kind of reaction
the other way.
the other way that is kind of unexpected but kind of very welcome.
Thank you. I think we've just got time for a couple of questions. Sean. There's a mic coming.
Thank you. My name is Sean Bai. I'm a Polish translator. I wanted to ask because China, Thailand, and Korea are all countries that have very large diaspora communities, and Poland is as well. I was just wondering if, in your experience, that diaspora community plays any role in helping to popularize the literature from these countries. Does it mean that they're more on the radar screen of publishers? Does it mean that you have networks of support that you might not have otherwise, access to funding that you might not have otherwise, or does it really make no difference at all?
I don't think, as far as Chinese go, it makes any difference at all. I mean, you have diaspora, you have people from Hong Kong living in this country, been here for years. They feel themselves very separate from the mainstream of Chinese, the mainstream mainland Chinese culture, including literary culture. Taiwan is, whether or not it considers itself a diaspora is a highly political point, has actually done a lot to publicize its literature. But in every other way, it doesn't really make much difference. I mean, you have floods of Chinese students over here in the States, in Australia. They're mainly into science, technology, business. Very few of them have come over to commune with translators like me. So, not much difference.
Same for me. I think that probably Thailand has somewhat fewer immigrants than from China, but I think that I don't see that at all. Like Nicky, I don't see that at all. I think that the Thai communities abroad, again, like the students, they tend to study something more businessy, and then I think where we've done really well with our export is food. I mean, so now that I'm working on trying to export Thai culture, I'm like, what is the secret to Pad Thai? Why is it so popular? But I'm still working on it.
Deborah?
And no difference from Korean, possibly because I work in the UK where there is a much, much smaller diaspora than in the US.
Can I just add something on that? Because as a translator from Polish, people have asked me endlessly in the last few years, oh, it must be marvellous for you. There's so many Poles in this country. That must be a huge boost for what you do. No, it's not. Because first of all, those Polish immigrants to Britain aren't going to read books in translation. They aren't necessarily going to read any books in any language. It doesn't go without saying. And then there is possibly more interest from British people, and it makes me laugh. I'll do writer events where Poles will have brought their English boyfriend along because they want him to take an interest in their culture, and you'll see some girl pressing some book on some unwilling-looking fella. But that's about it. Have we got any other questions? Is there? Yes. Paul.
It was just a comment, really. I mean, you say that it's no help having this Polish diaspora coming here. Does it not mean at least that those British people who are going to be reading your translations are at least sensitized to the fact that they're seeing Poles around them, and they think, oh, this is interesting.
Yes, they're more interested. Of course, they're more. I thought I'd said that, but I must have. I meant to say it if I didn't. Yeah, it means there is a bit more interest, and they're a bit more curious about Poles. But I don't think it does anything for publishers particularly. Any other question? Lady there, yes.
It's really more of a comment. All of you are from really big publishing countries. I was just wondering about underrepresented languages that are actually endangered languages, and really small countries. I haven't seen any of you mention that. I know you're all working from major languages, but have you thought about that problem?
Well, I think probably we're all on this panel to talk about our own specific areas, but there are publications like Words Without Borders that are looking to address that sort of issue and to try to cover everything. There's a lady there who wants to say something.
Yeah, sorry to jump in, Antonia. Just on that point, I wanted to mention a wonderful publishing house here in Britain who has published only languages that have a very, we think, low number of speakers. The dialects of England, but also Occitan, but also Sami. In fact, the publisher is going to be here tomorrow. The publishing house is called Francis Bootle.
Thank you. Peter's going to add something.
Just to say that many Catalan writers think that Catalan is an endangered species, even though there are 10 million speakers, because the present right-wing government in Spain has been trying to destabilize the bilingual situation in Catalonia and to make sure that Spanish is really the instrument of teaching in Catalan schools, so that kind of these languages may not be threatened in this way, but Catalonia and Catalans have to always be wary about the potential danger from decisions that are taken by a Ministry of Education in Madrid.
Thank you. There's a lady here who's going to ask a question.
Thank you very much for the fascinating panel, first of all. And then these last couple of weeks I've been reading a lot of articles saying that there are not so many women in translation. And Deborah already commented on this, saying that in her press she, has this quota. Do you think that those so-called underrepresented languages gives you also a chance to, have more agency in this respect, to maybe make good for what doesn't work in the mainstream?
Yeah, sure, definitely. It's about, when you are, and particularly not just a small press, but, Tilted Axis is a not-for-profit. And that means then that, yes, you are seeing yourself as having some kind of broader cultural goal. And yes, it gives you the ability to look beyond what might otherwise just be presented to you. I mean, I still do find when I go... I recently went to the Japan International Book Fair, and they have these brochures produced sort of introducing writers, and vast majority of the writers collected there are male, which seems a little bit strange to me because actually the situation in Japan seems closer to in South Korea in terms of the representation. And so I just... went through the book and read all the entries on female writers first, so that they would have that sort of extra chance to stick in my head. So it's not about sort of necessarily picking something, like this is going to be the diversity issue this year, but sort of recognizing that if you don't give yourself an explicit bias towards something, then the bias that is already existing and implicitly working against that will mean that you will never be able to redress it.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to say anything on that? Or,
Yeah, on the
okay.
female
Yeah.
writers issue, I think that there's a real danger, like for translators. I mean, for example, with Thai, I think that the field is very dominated by men at this time. So I'm just making up a number. Let's say 80% of the writers are men, and then you try to sort of pick a few that are representative. There's a real risk that the 20% of women could get cut out completely because you just sort of to funnel down. So I think that you need to really be aware of that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we've actually run out of time. So thank you very much indeed. Nicky Harman, Mui Poopoksakul, Deborah Smith, and Peter Bush. Thank you.